Alright y'all, so today I'm gonna show y'all how I animated the babies, the baby on baby 2 from start to finish. I go through my process in Photoshop, then how I went about animating in After Effects. I don't usually spend too much time concepting or planning. I kind of just cut it up and see where it takes me. Photoshop. As I slice this up like Freddy vs. Jason, I'd like to say that every edit is never the same. Different artists may expect different things. Some might want super exaggerated animation. Others might want something more subtle, something on the simpler side. Ain't nothing wrong with it. That's just what they want. You might even receive different types of assets from whatever designer you're working with. Sometimes it's just a flat image like this one, or you might get something PSD with a few layers, or you might even get an illustration that has 1,000 layers. I've worked with pretty high numbers of layers in a Photoshop file. You feel me? So just keep that in mind while you work, because it can change the process and actually how you work. So something to keep in mind. Anyways, as you can see, I'm using that lasso, the content aware fill, and that clone stamp. Those are my main ride or dies, as I don't use any other tools more than them, except if I'm doing an illustration. But we'll get into that another time. So for this cover, I decided that I just wanted to give him and his body parts some animation. So I made sure as I was cutting out, I had an idea, not necessarily what I was doing exactly, but I knew that I wanted to animate his arms, his legs. So as I'm cutting out, those are the things that I'm making sure I cut out: his body, the chair, his arms, and his legs. Anything I separated, I made sure to give some space. So I added a cushion of texture below it. So when I cut his arm out, on his body, I added a little space where the arm joint would be, so that when I animated the arm, it didn't leave an empty blank space. And once I'm done, I compress everything. Most of the time, because you're working with high definition images or large file size assets, I compress everything to 1080 pixels. That's not necessary, but one, it saves processing power, and while I'm working, it makes things move a little bit quicker because it saves processing power. When you get assets, they're normally super high. Like the minimum for assets on Apple, I believe, is 3,000 pixels. So once you get into cutting everything up and you have the more layers you have, the higher file size you have. So you don't want to have files that are super huge while you're working. It'll just slow you down. So I compress everything to 1080p or 1080 pixels, and that saves me a lot of time. And plus, on social media, you don't really notice the difference between super high quality animation and super low quality unless it's lower than 1080p. So that's usually what I keep my animation on. And then once I am done cutting everything up, I import it straight into After Effects. I don't know why y'all are importing Photoshop files into Premiere. You don't need to do that. Just import your Photoshop file straight into After Effects. After Effects. Okay, so when you're importing your files into After Effects, you'll be prompted with this message if it's a PSD. You can import it as a composition or composition with retaining the layer styles. Don't bring it in as footage. It'll flatten every layer and it'll be just like a video. So bring it in as a composition or composition with retained layer styles. If your image, if you have a layer that's not the full size of the composition, it will, retaining the layer sizes, you keep the edge of the image you cut out. If you chose composition, this layer would be the size of the composition, even though it's only this image. So I hope that makes sense. I'm not a technical person. In After Effects, before I animate, I make sure I parent my layers. Since arms and heads and legs move with the body, unless you're chopping someone up like Jason, things need to be attached. So I attach the arms, head, and legs to the upper body, and I also make sure my pivot points are where they need to be. The first thing I do is get my base animation. I animate the arm and the body rocking. That gives me a good idea for how I want the rest of the animation to move. Kind of like he's being creepy, waiting for someone to walk in the room and see him like that. For the right arm, I just use simple rotation animation. For the left arm, I use puppet pins. I pinned the shoulder, underarm, and elbow down so it would sit still when I animated the hands, which were just puppet pins on the fingers and knuckles. I used offset keyframes to get the fingers tapping animation, and that just added extra creepy to his already creepy. And a little foot rock using the puppet pins to give the extra creepy some impatience, because he tired of waiting. And I almost forgot about that puppet in the chair. Had to cut that out and fill in the empty space. And to animate the swinging arm, I used the same technique as I did the fingers. Not my best swinging animation, but it worked. It did what it was supposed to do. I actually forgot to do this in the beginning, so I actually hopped back into Photoshop, used content aware fill on the selection, exported it, imported it back into After Effects, and just plopped it in place. Adjusted the fit, feathered some edges, and boom, chain gone, sweater right. So whenever I add a sparkle, I always duplicate the chain layer and add a tint to make it black and white, levels to solo the highlights. Then I add a new layer with some animated turbulent noise as a track mat that'll give the layer some animated variation. Pre-compose that and then add the glimmer. It's a little extra to add some sparkle to a chain, but I like the results. And for the sparkle, I use the sparkle. For the sparkle, I used a plugin called Glimmer from Red Giant. Now, don't sleep on plugins, because if you can afford them, they can save you a hell of a lot of time. Absolutely worth it. Don't sleep on it. Now to animate the chain, it was just a simple left and right swing and looping those keyframes. To animate the face, I separated the eyelids and used the puppet pin. Using the puppet pin isn't always necessary for the eyelids. Sometimes liquify works really well, but it's all about preference and whatever works for you. But remember, eyes may look rough while you're working on them, but in real life, blinks are so fast that you barely even notice them. So when you're animating, keep that in mind also. I animated a few blink sequences, looped them, and moved on to the face, which is just more simple puppet pin animations. Had to add a little bit more attitude because he impatient, so he tired of waiting. And finally, to top it all off, I added some smoke and debris falling. This just fills out the scene a bit more and makes it a bit more interesting to look at. And then some camera moves in 3D space. Since everything is separated in layers, you can add some depth in there. It makes everything more interesting. And that's it. Alright, y'all, so if you want to see more of these types of videos, please comment, like, and subscribe and all that shit. I'm gonna make more videos like this, but your input is useful. it helps me know where to go with all the things that I'm gonna make. So comment, like, subscribe, all that shit. Peace.